Hello, everyone, and welcome to this evening's conversation between myself and the fabulous Vikki Reynolds. Vikki, you are an activist, a therapist, a researcher with a huge range of work, which I cannot do justice to. Would you like to introduce yourself to our students?
Thanks, Jodie. Thanks for having me. I'm Vikki Reynolds. I have a PhD and I'm a professor. I think people think of me as a trauma professor. Trauma is not a word I like, so I talk about people responding to oppression and violence. Um, I've been a therapeutic supervisor for, I guess, 3 decades, and I supervised people at the Center for Survivors of Torture, rape crisis centers, drug and alcohol programs, that kind of work. Working a lot now with homelessness, and we have the war on drugs here is having, um, well, we've had 42,000 Canadians die of illicit drugs, the drug poisoning disaster. So I'm supervising lots of workers in that. So that's the stuff that I do kind of work wise. Um, Academically, I've been a professor and taught a bunch of things. I have a website with all my stuff free on it. Mostly I write about trauma and resistance, about resisting the stuff that gets called vicarious trauma. I don't think we're mentally ill for being in this work. I don't think our clients harm us. I think people don't burn out. I think people are responding to spiritual pain. So those are like areas that of real interest to me. Just how do we take on this work as activists? A lot of my work is trying to bridge everything we know from solidarity movements, from social movements and social justice activism. How do we bridge that into the stuff that gets called community work or counseling and stuff like that? I'm a white settler. My people are from Ireland and England. And I live on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people here in Vancouver, Canada. And I work very hard to stay implicated as a white settler in the ways that I benefit from invasion, occupation, genocide, and assimilation. As an activist, that requires now I'm in solidarity with Palestine. And I'm in that struggle as a white settler on indigenous territories where genocide is still ongoing here. So thinking about how I am implicated and how I'm benefiting. So that's as an activist, I think one thing that's been important in our work and in the work I've kind of shouldered up over time has been being very immersed in the struggle against the death penalty, in particular in the United States. I worked for 23 men on death row who were all executed. Those guys taught me everybody's so much more than the worst thing they've ever done. I think that movement and being an abolitionist, I'm a prison abolitionist. When I say abolition, I mean what Angela Davis means, Black Panther and feminist from the United States, Angela Davis, who talks about abolition as no police, no policing, no surveillance. So I'm against family policing too, like I'm resisting these things. That's kind of, and I guess the other thing I would say is I've been the clinical supervisor at um, the transgender free clinic in East Van, where we set it up and ran it for, I was the clinical supervisor for 7 years. That was all volunteer. I am cisgendered and straight, but that's a community of struggle that has, embraced me, and I owe a great deal to that struggle, especially timely as the UK has just approved conversion therapy and is doing things to get it. The government is getting in the way of doctors and youth trying to do things like block puberty blockers. So it's very timely. So all of these kind of struggles, I've been really laterally mentored. My PhD hasn't been the site of a lot of learning. It's been lateral mentorship in these movements, supervising really good folks who ask great questions. And of course, as always, right, Jody, we know we learn this works on the backs of our clients. So I've had people on death row, survivors of torture and political violence, people who've experienced sexual assault of all genders, the queer trans community, lots of indigenous people who've survived political violence and torture from the Canadian state and genocide here. So that's kind of what I'm standing on.
You so much. What a brilliant introduction to the breadth and depth of your work. Um, as you said, so much of what you do can be held under the kind of cover of social justice or working with communities. Um, we're within this module and within this week thinking a little bit about what community work looks like, and it would be lovely to hear your thoughts about what that means to you, what the shape of community work is or can be.
I think, having an orientation for what I call justice doing requires everything we're doing is community work.
Mhm.
Oh, there's a little sign you can see here. I'm trying to get my finger right on it. It's got a bunch of crows flying in different directions, and it says, "Who keeps us safe? We keep us safe." You know, even that abolitionist approach is about community work, that communities of struggle have always organized to keep each other safe. I immerse all of my work in community. When I'm working with survivors of torture and political violence, people are very isolated as refugees. The goal is that ethic of belonging. I talk about an ethic of belonging, which I believe comes from my grandmother, Maggie O'Rourke, and my Irish clan culture, spiritually and culturally. Um, this ethic of, like, holding people together. I've always known in my family, my father, Bill Reynolds, was an Irish, like, a very extremely collaborative dude who, like, gathered people in family. His idea of family was huge. I have a cousin who always says, "What I loved about your father is every time he sees me, he says, 'Hello, nephew,' like saying we are related, that it's
Yeah.
not your name, it's our let's speak of our relationship," which many cultures do. It's just my family really still does, and I still do with my young ones. "Hello, nephew. Hello, niece." Um, so I think immersing things in community work, deprofessionalizes us, situates us outside of these academic and capital P professional situations. I've often said having a PhD in psychology, it brings with it a great arrogance because what my 27 years of school has trained me to do is as soon as I meet you, Jody, I've been invited to start to look for what's deficit about you, how you're broken, do an assessment immediately, and then start to do a more formal diagnosis in which I can ask questions in a way that might replicate being interrogated. And because I'm only looking for deficit, right? And then I decide how you're broken, and then I make a treatment plan, then I fix you. That's not how community work works.
Mhm.
Community work is you center the community. I think to do ethical work, we track ethics, who's most vulnerable, we center them. That's who we need to be listening to. So I think about community work as being centered in communities of struggle, communities of resistance. I think of things like Idle No More is a movement here in Canada that went around the world, created by Indigenous women in particular. And what was for me, that was one of the first times as an activist I went to events where all of the white people moved back, all of the people of black and people of color moved forward. Indigenous people went to the center, and then Indigenous women went to the mics. That's community work where you're centering, and what they were speaking of is the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. They're talking about the violence of what was called residential schools and the kidnapping of children and the murdering of those children. So who's the right people are speaking and everybody's organized around that. I take that approach to family work and therapy, that people are
Mm.
immersed in community and connection and belonging.
Lovely. And I know as part of that, solidarity is a big part of the way in which you work. Are there ways in which our students can understand that position of solidarity within the different roles in which they work?
Oh, it's a great question. Thanks for that. Yeah. Um, so, when I did my PhD, I pretty much wrote a book about the supervision of solidarity. That's what I think I do, a
Mm.
supervision of solidarity. And there were questions on my committee about, well, that's very political. Couldn't you call it a supervision of support? I
Oh,
was
how
like,
interesting.
no. Yeah, what's interesting about that for you?
The threat, I guess, that comes with the idea of politicization within the practice of therapeutic work.
Just even bringing up the language of solidarity threatens
Mm.
the order of professionalism, doesn't it?
Mm.
Because support, like what support can look like in supervision is you come to me, Jody, and tell me you've really been fat phobic with a client, that you lost the plot and started to lecture them about donuts and things. Um, and then, and I say, oh, but you're such a good and kind person and you didn't mean
Mm.
that. Let's both take deep breaths and ground ourselves and feel better about it.
Mm.
So that's a supervision of support. It's unethical. It
Mhm.
prioritizes our relationship and your comfort,
Mhm.
over just relationships with clients. Right? A supervision of solidarity would engage a whole different ethic. Solidarity is not about unity or agreeing on things. It's about finding points of connection and organizing ourselves around our collective ethics, but doing that many ways. I always say there are many paths to liberation. So if you were to come to me and say, I was in a conversation with a woman of size, she identified as fat and was talking about how she was being oppressed, and I started to lecture her about how to get thin and diet and what she was eating. And then I realized, I think I've been pretty fat phobic, or we might come up to that. I
Mhm.
would lean in to you and say, "Wow, I've also been caught up in body policing, primarily of poor women, eh? How did we get caught up? Given we both have an ethic of feminism, given we both have a politics that understand the violence of poverty, how did we get captured to start to replicate that
Mhm.
hell on this poor woman, right? On this woman we've oppressed. Wow.
Mhm.
What made the conditions that we dropped our ethics and all of a sudden started to be part of the policing of this woman's body? How did we fall into that?" And and question it, and then and get really curious about that, and then think about how will we make repair? Do you need me to go alongside you to make repair with this person? Or what's your plan for making repair? How are you gonna take this accountability conversation back to your client? Do you want me to
Mm.
come with you? Do you wanna do it alone? And do you think, Jody, do you think this is something we've let slip on the team? Because I noticed last week at the staff meeting, someone said, "Oh, I can have a donut. I biked to work, so I burned off calories." I mean, that's fat phobic. That judges people in fat bodies, right? And I don't think I said anything, although it bothered me. I wonder if we have lost a bit of the plot here. That's how it would go. So you can see how solidarity, I hope in that like kind of practice example is so different than supervision. And a support can just replicate me helping you feel comfortable again. Whereas solidarity says, let's both get very uncomfortable about something we've done that's unethical. And instead of, the other way those conversations go is to say, yeah, well, that woman really isn't taking responsibility for her health, is she? So we could find ways always in psychological talk to pathologize this client more so it makes sense that we disrespected them. So it's okay that we were unethical because the clients, we've got all this, oh, they've got depression, they've got that, talking about how broken the client is instead of saying, no, what actually happened here is we transgressed our ethics. How did we get slipped up in that? How do we repair that? How do we make sure we don't do that? Let's get curious about what else are we not seeing? So that's how I like solidarity I think is cornered in revolutionary love, just to say the L word, that most, you know, 27 years of school, I never had a professor use the word love. Um, but revolutionary love is a commitment to others and a solidarity with their cause. That's what Paulo Freire says. Revolutionary love is a commitment to others and a solidarity with their cause. And I think that's the revolutionary love we want to bring into our practice, right? That solidarity is a spirited practice of shouldering each other up. Mm.
I'm hearing real parallels in the kind of the way in which you might work within teams with the way in which you work within communities, that kind of connection to each other, the rigor of self-reflection and care across one another. Are there other things that you consider to be vital to support individual practitioners or teams of practitioners to do this work within social justice? How can practitioners be supported to do it well and
Well,
to
I think,
keep doing it well?
yeah, okay. And to keep doing it well is the next question, isn't it?
Mm.
Um, but I think we need to start with ethics. I became a clinical supervisor and I started to write about clinical supervision because most of the I did all the clinical supervision courses you could take and was very interested in what people were doing to supervise because I was taken with a huge humility, just thinking I don't, I was asked to supervise people when I was pretty new to the practice. I didn't
Mm.
become a therapist till I was 35. I had been an activist and done group organizing my whole life, but so I was asked to supervise a group of amazing women who mostly had PhDs and were working at a university setting at the Women's Center in a university. And I was, quote, yeah, I was just a therapist at a drug and alcohol program. And they had heard me talk and they're like, we want that. And I was like, "No, I'm not old enough for that. I don't have a PhD for that. I'm not," I was really skeptical. So I tried to, study as much and read and I just thought, okay, how do people become like at what point do you become a supervisor? This is a big question, isn't it? Well, I think it's when people start to ask you because they see you've got something they want. So
Mm,
I said to these women, no, I don't think so. And they said, well, let's meet. Could you just meet with us? And I said, like, what is it you want from me? And they said, you're an activist. And all of us we came to this work thinking that we were gonna kinda do justice, and we're not. We've really lost the plot of that. And when we heard you speaking about a conference, I was just speaking about some of my work, they were like, you are immersing your work in justice doing." And, I created the language of justice doing. Allie Borden actually gave me that language from a colleague from LA. She said, I said, doing justice," and she said, "You're justice doing." Anyway, they what they wanted was the activism, the centering of ethics, the transformation, the resistance to psychology's neutrality and objectivity, the overt politics for justice doing, right? And I was naming at that time 30 years ago, everybody was saying I was too political because I have sleeve tattoos and I swear and I start by saying what I'm about. Um,
mm.
that I was too political and I was like, to be neutral is to be extremely political and side in psychotherapy with white supremacy, with massive class privilege, like who gets to go to university and be a therapist, like to side with patriarchal values on many points and side with capitalism. Like if we don't know what you're about, I don't know that you're in solidarity with women in poverty. You might just sit there and tell them to stop eating donuts and blame them, you know, using capitalism, patriarchy, and white supremacy, blame people for their own suffering. That's what kind of psychology is about. So I started to think about what is supervision about, and many great teachers have, taken apart the supervision. Like I don't have any, what have I got? So for me, I think about bringing community into it. If when I think about supporting teams and supporting individual therapists, I want to start with ethics because supervision that I was taught and that is so talked about centers theory and practice. And I know your students are studying, they are reading theoretical stuff right now and trying to build their own theoretical orientation, as they should. And then we want to look at practice and see, is this in line theoretically? Like, if this is what you're thinking theoretically, then your practice should reveal this. But for me, what was disappeared in all of this, of course, was ethics. For me, ethics is more important than theory and practice. And so for me, it's when I look at your practice that your ethics are revealed. Like if I say that I'm about doing dignity with people, but I'm actually interrogating people, there's no collaboration. There's a real abuse of power there. So for me, I think students and people new to the work or people probably have tons of lived and living experience coming to this, but if you're starting to think about doing quote a therapeutic practice, I want to invite people to think about their ethical stance for the work. What are your ethics? What are you standing on? And in teams, always talking about collective ethics. What do we agree on collectively is the heart of our work, collective values, intentions, commitments, you know? For me, that is the heart of the work. And the other part of your question, Jody, was how do you stay in the work? Stay ethical. Because what I believe is it's not vicarious trauma or burnout that cause people to leave the work. If we can stay ethical and enact our collective ethics for this work, even though people die and it's hard and children get taken by the state, um, we can stay even, I think about the guys on death row, they all got executed, but I know we were ethical with them. We treated them as humans. Um, yeah, that even though it's heartbreaking, if your work is in line with your ethics and your collective ethics, you can have sustainability. But if what we end up doing is unethical, then it's not burnout, it's spiritual pain or ethical pain that says, here's the ethics that drew me to this work and I've transgressed them. So for me, I think the core, the piece is standing on your ethics, commitments, values, articulating those, being in a really good, messy struggle with others, dialogically figuring out what are our collective ethics, and then trying to keep your practice and theory in line with those.
That sounds like a lovely recipe for a kind of sustainable. practice in the long term. I know in relation to some of those thoughts you've talked about this idea of the zone of fabulousness, which is just such a fabulous term. Would you want to say any more about the zone of fabulousness?
Yeah,
Um,
just yeah, thanks. Just to be playful and a nod to queer theory, because I'm straight and cisgendered, but I owe so much to queer theory and queer activism. Um, so I created a zone of fabulousness. It's my response to vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, burnout, like all these psychological ways to look at how workers are mentally ill and harmed by clients. The zone of fabulousness is a way of thinking about um, how we're doing in the work that's client centered as opposed to staff centered. So instead of taking a bunch of questions to see whether you're burned out, do you think about your clients after sessions? Do you have bad images? How do you sleep? Instead of interrogating our mental health, what I care about is how you treat people.
Mhm.
So I think we're the right people to do this work. Everybody's always got the right collective ethics at the heart of what they want to do, but we get tired, we get exhausted, we lose our housing, our relationships break up. And then I think we kind of slip one way or another. We either move too close to some clients and get enmeshed with them and create superhero relationships and try to save somebody and don't do the rest of our job and abandon the rest of our
Mhm.
team, right? Or we move too far the other way and get with disconnection and we start to get madly cynical. This place is bullshit. Don't even read the policy thing. They come up with different crap all the time. Nothing changes here. Like massive negativity and cynicism. So I think, that enmeshment moves us to that heroic thing and that disconnection leads us to bullying and massive negativity. And we want to be in the center in that zone of fabulousness. And that is a collective care space, right? That's where the client is at the center. It doesn't matter whether you like your teammates or not, you have respect for them. It's our job to build respect and dignity in relationship with all our coworkers. You feel like the client's at the center, we're walking our talk on our ethics. I have respect for my team and we're useful to people. And it's actually about the clients. So that zone of fabulousness is just a really fluid way of thinking about how are you in relationship to your ethics. I think if we can stay in that zone of fabulousness, which is a really fluid place,
Mm.
um, we can stay sustained in the work. And for me, it's a more useful way to think about it than are you burned out or do you have vicarious trauma?
Is there anything more you'd want to say about vicarious trauma? Because it's a term that we've touched upon within teaching, and it's a term that has a valence, I guess, within the literature and within the clinical practice. Yeah, is there anything else you'd want to say about it as a concept or your feelings about its usefulness?
Well, yeah, I mean, what's really important for all your students is think about the history of ideas.
Mhm,
Words do things.
mhm.
Helen Brand is a Black Canadian poet. I'm forgetting which country she comes from right now. Um, and she says, no language is neutral. Every word takes a position and has a stand for something, you know? The language. So I think one thing we need to do is really interrogate all of the language of psychology that passes for
That's true.
normal. Just before I get to vicarious trauma, just think about ego. Some said maybe my ego was getting in the way. And my question was like, oh, where do you keep your ego? And they're like, oh, what do you mean? I was like, is it in your, id, ego, super ego? Is that how you believe you are constructed as a human in relation to others? And they're like, well, I kind of guess not. It's like, why are we using the language of ego? And ego, it's something people think is real. So I'm not saying it's not real. I'm just saying it's just a set of ideas. 200 years ago, we didn't have egos. We had
Mm,
intentions and stuff, right? And then I think about things like personality disorders.
mhm,
This is really problematic. We used to had ways of being and hopes and aspirations. Now we have personalities. And once you have a
mhm,
personality, you can have a personality disorder. And once you have a personality, because there's no personality not disordered. Um,
mhm,
there's only disordered personalities, and
mhm,
then, you get a medication for that. Personality disorder is a death sentence. It is not amenable to change. This is you for the rest of your life. I don't believe that. So, but personality disorder, when I challenge that in supervision, people are like, "Wow, it's the first time I've heard a professor or someone say, "Do you think that's right?" Or "Where'd that idea come from?" Like, the
Mm.
history of ideas really matters. Well, vicarious trauma is premise it's a new idea, also comes from the 1980s, that workers get hurt in the work, which is true. But the kind of harms but remind yourself, this most of this research was from a medical perspective and the realm of psychiatrists. Psychiatrists, of course, are medical doctors who do more work in human relations, but that medical orientation is a disease model orientation.
Mhm.
So when we talk about vicarious trauma, it's a way of understanding the struggles and heartbreak and impacts of the work on people from a medical perspective and from a psychological perspective, as if you are mentally ill for doing this work. And the premise of it, if you read the literature, is that clients infect therapists with their hopelessness. That's a
Mm.
direct quote from one of the psychiatrists who wrote this. Clients infect workers with their hopelessness. I don't work with any workers who believe that. So when
Mhm.
people tell me they've got vicarious trauma, I'm like, where'd you get it? Like, oh,
Mm.
because this and that. And I'm like, oh, no, no, no. Vicarious trauma means that, you know, there's actually a transmission of traumatic shock from the client to you as the worker. Like, it's centered on the harm from the client.
Mm.
And I think as a social justice activist, that this is unethical. I don't,
Mhm.
after 30 years of being a clinical supervisor, I believe in um, that research is important. As Patty Lather says, Professor Patty Lather says, research is important not for what it can measure, but for what it can do. She's talking about catalytic validity. Things are valuable
Mhm.
because they get picked up and moved. Like that whole zone of fabulous, Jody. People are running with that. It makes sense to people. People like
Yeah.
that, you know, loose, fun model. Like, it's got catalytic validity, but I've never done any research. I'm not saying it's real or it's provable or repl or any of that stuff. Um, yeah, so yeah. So when I think about, people staying alive in this work, I think about, like, how do we stay alive in this work is very different than how do I resist burnout or resist vicarious trauma. So what I believe is if what I have seen and heard from workers, like I said, in all of these different contexts that are the context of the work is the thing we need to consider. So I'm going to like the work that I'm supervising happens in the politics of necropolitics, right? From Mbembe's ideas, policies that actually kill people, like this new policy in the UK that's going to kill trans kids. You know, that's necropolitics, right? And then structural and targeted abandonment. Thinking about here in Canada, um, the people who are dying from the opiate catastrophe, then the drug poisoning, like the drug poisoning catastrophe, which is all about bad drug policy. It's people who are targeted for abandonment, poor people, drug users, primarily indigenous people, right? So just thinking about that targeted abandonment from Ruth Wilson Gilmore's abolitionist work and Mbembe's ideas, you know, of necropolitics. That's the context of the work. That's where the harm comes to the worker, not getting infected with hopelessness by clients, but being in structures where we cannot deliver care. We can't give people what they need. I've supervised so many housing workers. There's no housing. So they feel like they feel like they're not doing their job. They're in a spiritual pain or an ethical pain because they came here to house people and they're part of policing people and abandoning people. You know, that's not because these folks who lack housing are infecting them with hopelessness, right? You can just see how it falls apart when you start to take a look at it. But like, I just think there's a lot of psychology talk that obscures more than it reveals, right? And if we're not rigorous as students of the game, I mean, ongoing learners about this, thinking about what does this idea mean? What's it stand for? When I say the word vicarious trauma, what am I holding up? Well, you're holding up an idea that clients cause the harm to workers. And I think that's unethical. Of course, the other problem with this, Jody, is the answer to vicarious trauma and burnout is always self care, right? Which is the opposite of how you started, which is about community.
And are there ways in which, if we're working from this community level perspective, if we're thinking about social justice, about ethics being our motivators, What's your sense of what level people work at? If you're working as a housing worker, what is your responsibility to be feeding into politics, policy, um, preventing necro policies? Yeah, how can we understand what level of intervention is the most effective one for us as any individual worker to place our energies?
Yeah, I think this is everyone's question. One,
Mm,
I think this is our quest. This is what we're here for.
mm,
One question I ask people in clinical supervision all the time is, what is the best use of you?
mm,
What is the best, what is the best use of you? Like, there's a reason you're teaching, Jody. Like, you've picked up being a professor, right? And teaching this to other folks instead of just having like a more solid, like you could just be seeing people in private practice more. There's a reason you've done this,
mhm.
It's probably around, it's probably part of that answer of what's the best use of you. Like if I look at my quote career, it doesn't make much sense from a capitalist perspective or from a patriarchal moving up perspective, right?
Mhm.
But it makes total sense if I'm tracking what is the best use of me. So I was a professor, well published, speaking internationally, and pretty much walked out of the university to work alongside drug users because we're having a massacre of drug using people in this country because of the war on drugs. The best use of me is being right down there trying to keep people who are using drugs alive in the work to try to help overturn these drug poisonings and keep people alive. So, um, I worked with guys on death row for a decade. When the last guy was executed, I actually thought I was going to get a law degree and become a death row lawyer. And then I had some really good American law professors say, Vicky, this isn't going to be the best use of you. You're
Mm,
probably never gonna get anybody off death row. The American killing machine was just starting to go. At that time, I got involved when they were starting to kill, they brought the death penalty back and were killing one person in California. That's why I got involved. Well, then Texas started to kill more than a person a week. They're like, this might not be the best struggle for you. I ended up doing a master's in psychology and moving to work with survivors of political violence and torture who were refugees. What qualified me for that work was not having a master's in psychology, it was death row work, right? So, like I move, I'm always following what is the best use of me. And so then I became a clinical supervisor instead of just seeing more clients because the ideas that I was, what I was doing with survivors of torture, tracking their acts of resistance as opposed to seeing them as traumatized. Again, that's language I don't like. It's medical language that obscures people's resistance and talks about them as broken and blames them for their own suffering. I was talking about people's acts of resistance and people were getting better, and people like Alan Wade really encouraged me, you've got to publish this, you got to put this out, this matters. So then I started to write, then I did a PhD to get that out so it would get listened to. As soon as you
mm.
become a PhD, all of a sudden it's not just an idea, it's a real thing. You know, Gail Simon in the UK was very big in promoting me and holding up my work and yeah, and my research quote methodology. I didn't care about my research methodology. And Gail Simon said, we have to publish that, Vicky, so people can use it. Like you actually have to publish this. So she published an article for me or a book chapter for me in a book she wrote. Systemic therapies and transformational practice. Oh, yeah, with Imelda
Mm,
McCarthy. And then I wrote that a chapter called A Solidarity Approach, the Rhizome and Messy Practice. And so
mm,
and so I laid out how I kept all of my quote research to solidarity. I never wanted to do a PhD for class reasons, also just felt it would elevate me. And I couldn't figure out a way to not exploit people who are survivors of torture, survivors of sexualized violence. I didn't want to research people who'd been oppressed to make me a
mhm,
doctor. Um, so
mhm,
instead, I had everybody that I supervise research me and tell me what they thought I was doing. So because once I figured out, and that's how I came up with a supervision of solidarity. Oh, this is the stuff I'm doing. People are telling me this is what you're doing that matters. That's
mhm,
what I did for my PhD pretty much. But then Gail said, you got to publish this methodology. And I said, it's really not much of a methodology. She goes, it isn't, but people want to use it. And if you publish it in this book, it'll become a real methodology and they can use it.
mhm,
So that's why I published that. the question is always, what is the best use of me? Gail Simon invited me to publish something I didn't want to write. And I wasn't that interested in writing. And then she told me it would be useful. Then I got very excited about it. Right. So,
Mm.
because every time I'm writing something, I'm out of direct action, and I think then we got to take Noam Chomsky, and, Bell Hooks in mind. Like, Bell Hooks says, "Theorizing is a piece of activism." Bell Hooks, Black feminist from the United States, says, "I came to theory because I was aching, because I was in pain, because I was hurting, and I saw in theory avenues for liberation, that
Mm.
theorizing is a piece of social movements," right? And then Noam Chomsky, um white, older Jewish intellectual from the United States, anarchist, Noam Chomsky says, In movements, it's important that we're not just theorizing and not moving it to action.
Yeah.
That's just having a party in your brain. But we also can't just do direct actions without theorizing about it,
Mhm.
right? Because that can be reckless. So these amazing mentors of mine, I guess, um, Ken Gergen was, my official advisor for my PhD, and he talked to me, he said, "You have a lot of textual allies." Like, I circle myself with these a activist thinkers and theorizers, because that helps direct what I'm doing, right? Not doing it alone.
Yeah,
So
it's
I
community. It's all levels of community, isn't it? And connection.
always, always. I talk about solidarity groups and building solidarity teams for things, and I had a whole team of people known to me and not, like Noam Chomsky and Bell Hooks were on my team
Great
for
people
my
to have on your
PhD.
side.
What's that?
Great people to have on your side if you're gonna pick your team.
Yeah.
Great people to go to.
So I'm always not ever, always resisting individualism and thinking about collective action and then
Mm.
thinking about like what's the worth of this. So I think for all workers, to get back to your like question, is thinking what's the best use of me? You know,
Mhm.
and Angela Davis, I think, has such a beautiful way of realigning the ideas of Crenshaw, Kimberly Crenshaw's ideas of intersectionality, the domains of identity and how we're made by our intersectional identities. But Angela Davis says it's the intersection of struggle that we want to meet in, not the intersection of identity. And so I
Mhm.
think for students and therapists, given your intersection of struggles, given your accesses to privilege, of which a master's degree is more, right? Or given your sites of struggle and oppression, or harm, given this context of your life, what's the best use of you?
Mhm.
What is the best use of you? And that's what I try to follow, and that's how I kind of supervise.
Mm.
Walk alongside people, collaborate around what might be the best use of them.
Sounds like there's a real invitation there, which is something that we've been doing throughout the program of inviting people to reflect upon themselves and to understand themselves within the context of their wider communities, their wider experiences, what they're bringing to the work, and what their ethics are, I guess, as well. Another point of reflection.
Yeah, yeah. And, how do you do that and how you do that ongoingly with
Mm,
students?
mm. It's a really interesting task, isn't it? I think we've been throughout the program trying to find ways to connect people to experiences of reflection. We have a reflective log. Students will be rolling their eyes, I'm sure, as they watch this around
Yeah,
um, those kind of points of what does this theory mean? That internal discursiveness that you're talking about there, we're referring to between the theory and the activism. What does this mean to what that's going to be for me, and how do I filter it through myself and my experiences, my knowledge, my preferences, my values, my ethics? Um, but it's a complex process, isn't it? It's not necessarily an
yeah,
easy one or an easy muscle
yeah,
for each of us to stretch.
yeah. But I think it's really important that you've structured that into your pedagogy, into your educational community work there. Because I remember doing my master's. I'm a real nerd and I took, lots of notes and was excited by ideas and stuff. But I always drew a line down the page to have a third of the page where I connected the people they're not talking about, like Franz Fanon, black
Yeah.
psychiatrist Franz Fanon, who was from Martinique. He was black. He um, fought in the Algerian War for independence against France, and he wrote a lot about survivors of torture and
Mm.
how torture was social, and talked about how colonizers psychology is used to psychologize and make deficit people who are colonized. So we have all this psychology language for people, indigenous people having multi-generational harm and stuff like that. And he said we should actually be looking at the mental illness of the colonizer. Like
Mm.
there's no psychological labels for people colonizing, but there's 100 ways psychology is wielded to talk about people who are colonized as mentally ill. So that was never talked about in my university degree. So in my classes, when they were talking about stuff, and I was like writing in the margins, who's missing? Who I knew from activism. I didn't even know Frantz Fanon was a psychiatrist when I read The Wretched of the Earth. I read it as an activist when I was living in Botswana in Africa. It made a lot of sense to me. So I
Mm.
started to write who was there, but also writing in the margins how this is connected to my life or my struggle or my activism, like trying to make it land.
Mm.
Otherwise, it's just smart stuff and it comes off as neutral knowings, right? And then you get a PhD in arrogance, right? So just trying to think, how do I land this? Like that reflexivity for me, that is supervision. And Gail Simon again. We just emailed each other, so maybe she's just sweetly on and kind of in solidarity and accompanying me. But Gail Simon wrote a gorgeous article that mattered a long time to go to me in supervision about self supervision, but resisting self surveillance. Like, we don't want to be policing ourselves. We want to be investigating and being critical. Like it was such a gorgeous way of thinking about it. So that's what I always think about in your student self reflexive journals is
Mm.
for me in supervision. I always have these reflexive, recursive questions that I think about and I go back and forth with. I never answer them. I never settle them. I never end them. For example, one question I often ask is, how am I responding to power in this moment?
Mm.
Right? I'm tracking vulnerability. Who has the least access to power needs to be centered in this conversation. Like these are questions I'm always asking. And I think the
Mm.
practice you're inviting your students into is a reflexive practice. Like, what are the questions you're going to continue, like provocations?
Mhm.
Scott Curry taught me that it's provocations more than questions. What are these provocations that are going to keep provoking you, that you're going to keep alive in your relationship, as Gail Simon would say, in your self-reflexive supervision practice with yourself? What are the questions you're going to carry around, the provocations that are going to, keep you in line with these collective ethics, right? And
So
approaching your education like that, like starting that out as, you folks doing that in your education, that's brilliant. Yeah.
we really connect with it as a kind of value base, as an important part of a learning journey, whatever that might look like. It really, I can see the parallels as well from where our conversation started, and that idea of the kind of solidarity with others and ensuring that we pick other people up and support them to really interrogate what they're doing, but to have that kind of warm rigor with ourselves as well, being an important part of our practice. Um, is there anything that I haven't asked you about, Vicky, that feels like a core part of your brilliant way of understanding the world and understanding this work that you would want our students to be able to hear about?
I would say the other key piece of the work for me is the work on resistance. So,
Mm.
you know, um, I I think the last article I've written that kind of matters is about trauma and resistance.
Mhm.
Thinking about how trauma has become so normalized. Um, and we think about people as broken internally in their synapses from trauma, and how, again, like the talk about personality disorder, how thinking about someone as traumatized, what does that make it impossible to understand the context of their lives, the fact that it's oppression, you know so I don't think people are traumatized. Most of the folks I work with, it's oppression. They're responding to oppression, and people aren't broken. They've got these acts of resistance. And I see all the ways that psychology looks at people's acts of resistance and
Mm.
sees them as criteria of mental illness, that they're broken. So when I started to work with survivors of torture, um, I don't ask people how they're broken, how they've been tortured, how they've been dehumanized, how they've been degraded. I really am concerned about this trauma focus where you can have a conversation with a person who's been brutally tortured. And what happens 5 hours after that session? Does that person wanna kill themselves? Does that person wanna drink enough alcohol to black out because you know? And I'm not
Mhm.
talking about re-traumatizing or not getting back in the trauma window. I'm like, if we're focusing on that trauma, what is our purpose?
Mhm.
Where, what I and my work is very aligned with Alan Wade's work. He, from the response-based practice. I mean, we came to it individually. We were introduced by Imelda McCarthy from Ireland. Um, he comes to this from like a really critical linguistic center. I come to this from direct action activism. So when I started to work with survivors of torture, I was looking for what Goffman would call that people are activists in their own lives. So when someone
Mhm.
tells me they've been tortured, my first response is most people who are tortured are dead and you're still alive. This is amazing. Can you teach me how it is you're alive? How did you resist? And then I
Mhm.
just go on and have these rich histories of resistance from people. And it's
Mhm.
not that I don't hear about torture and trauma, but I'm
Mhm.
not my key is not getting into the trauma. I need to know enough about the torture and the oppression so that the person's acts of resistance make sense,
Yeah.
right? So I wrote an article called Hang Time. It was a compilation of a bunch of folks that I'd worked with, but one young guy gave me his permission to kind of use it. And the one strategy, this youth was pathologized as having trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, and dissociation. But the guts of what happened, and that article's on my website for free. Hang Time: Innovative Responses to Oppression and Suffering. Um, this youth was being sexually assaulted and beaten, and he had a big picture of Michael Jordan in his room. Michael Jordan, the basketball player who was his hero, was an old photo. Somehow we got this old thing of Michael Jordan. And whenever he was being assaulted and abused, he would, quote, "dissociate." That's what we would say in psychology. He would dissociate, leave his body, but actually, as an act of resistance, he would go into hang time with Michael Jordan and hang in the air with the ball in his hand, and then when his on the basketball court, and then when his uncle or whatever had finished assaulting him, he would come back into his body, slam dunk the basketball, and be back in his body. Now that's a you can understand that as dissociation, as this kid is absolutely mentally ill. He has dissociation. This is a criteria of trauma. He has post-traumatic stress disorder. You could line it up like that. Or you could see this kid as effing amazing and brilliant and creative and smart. And what he did, Jody, is he created solidarity.
Mhm.
Knew that he couldn't stop this alone, so he looked for solidarity. He found a hero, Michael Jordan, to keep him alive through this. Like, I got
Mhm.
energy going up my arms just talking about it.
Mhm.
These are the stories I have with folks, you know,
Mhm.
that they're not, and then looking for how he thought of that and how smart that was, right? And all of these other, just
Mhm.
it's such a different road to look at people's acts of resistance as opposed to look at how they're mentally ill and broken, right?
Mhm.
And I think that has come to me from political activism and from being a witness to people who were survivors of torture, um, that I've met throughout activism and throughout my life before I was a therapist. And it
Mhm.
never occurred to me when I started to work as a therapist at the Center for Survivors of Torture. It never occurred to me to ask people how people were tortured. Why would I do that? If we were in solidarity together just as activists, just in solidarity work, which is a lot of what I've already had done, and you told me, that you were incarcerated and it was horrible. Like guys I knew the abolition struggle against the death penalty, there were a lot of, and there still are many great activists committing their lives to that, who are guys who were wrongly accused, who were on death row and got free, and they've committed their lives to saving other folks. I got the honor of meeting these people in my death row work. Like everybody thinks I got vicarious trauma. I met like amazing
Mhm.
humans. When we were just talking as activists, I would never ask them, "Did the guards strip search you? How humiliating was that? Did they
Mhm.
ever touch your testicles?" Like, what like, where do trauma therapists think they have the right to go here? But this is I would never ask that of, someone I was in solidarity with revolutionary love, right? So, I never did. I always said, "You know, dude, you came out of death row and being locked up and tortured with love in your heart, and here you are trying to save other folks. How'd you do that? How did you stay human in these situations outside of human understanding?" And then they just started to tell me all these amazing
Mm,
things they did in prison to stay human.
mm.
It was amazing, right? That's where my education came from.
Yeah.
And so in my relationships with another activist in solidarity, if there was a question I wouldn't have asked because I thought it was degrading, demoralizing, and inappropriate, why would I do that as a therapist because I'm being held up with the power of the academy? And
Mhm.
professionalism, right? So and I want to be clear, there's many ways to do there's many way past deliberation. I'm just talking about what is a fit for me. I'm not like there's all kinds of people doing fabulous trauma work in all kinds of ways. That's not a fit for me in justice doing. That's not how I see it. I don't like the language of trauma. Yeah. So I think about acts of resistance and centering acts of resistance, being in solidarity with people and yeah, that's the path to wellness is focusing on people's acts of resistance, what that tells us about their humanity and their abilities and their connections and who their witnesses are. I'm an activist, so I want
Yes.
to, even when you can't deliver justice to people, you can create
Mhm.
sites where people feel witnessed and held in that ethical belonging. That's what really informs that piece of my work. So I think those are the kind of biggest pieces of the work I do.
That's fabulous. Thank you so much, Vicky, for sharing that. There's so many threads that I'm sure each of our students watching this will be pulling on, and be able to embed in their work. Being fabulous and holding solidarity and holding justice and holding love,
Yeah.
which I hope has really connected with them, and I'm sure will have done. I really appreciate your time.
Well, thanks
Um,
so much.
Thank you. And we will link to all of your lovely resources on your website and the
Okay,
generosity with
great.
which you share those. So there's lots more students that you can be reading of Vicky's work if your appetite has been whetted today.
Thanks for
Thank
having
you,
me.
Vicky.